All right, so here we go. I want to review. I do want to review a little bit from yesterday before we get into speech and press and assembly today. Okay. What do you remember about selective incorporation? What does it involve? What does it mean? Okay, what's selective incorporation? Okay, pick a lot of cases, right? Not all at the same time. Okay, what else do we know about selective incorporation? What is it?
It's a funnel.
It's a funnel. What's in the funnel?
Like a ton of rights at the top, but you have to.
What rights specifically? Where do we find these rights? In the Bill of Rights. Okay? So they're all in this funnel. But why did I say it's in a funnel? Because what happens at the end of a funnel? Has a neck, right? So what goes through that? One right at a time. One case at a time decided by the Supreme Court. But what is the Supreme Court using to decide these cases? What amendment does the Supreme Court be using to decide these cases? The 14th Amendment. Okay, so the Supreme Court is using the 14th Amendment to tell the states that they have to follow what? That they have to follow the Bill of Rights. What clause in the 14th Amendment is the Supreme Court using? Due process clause. So repeat after me. You ready?
I'm ready.
No state.
No state
shall deny any citizen.
Shall deny any citizen
The right.
the right
To life.
to life,
Liberty.
liberty,
And property.
and property
Without.
without
Finish it.
Due process.
due process of law.
Due process of law. No state shall deny any citizen the right to life without due process of law. Okay? Good job. Now, like you said, it's selective because the Supreme Court only hears one case at a time. Right? What was the first incorporation case?
Get low.
Get it over. For those of you on YouTube, this means get it over. Get low versus New York. What right did it incorporate?
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech. All right, good. All right. So, what is the Establishment Clause? That the government cannot do what with religion? Establish a national religion. Okay, so let's go over some examples of the Establishment Clause. What's the court case? What did it say that this is a violation of the Establishment Clause? We can't do what in schools?
Prayer.
Can't have a school cannot lead you in a prayer, right?
Yeah.
What was the name of the case? England versus Vital. What's another example of a violation of the Establishment Clause I gave you, talking about school busing?
St. John's.
St. John's could not use our public school buses to go where? To the Ark, right? Because there is a religious purpose. So, what was the test that I said the court uses this test to decide whether or not something violates the Establishment Clause?
The lemon.
Lemon test, not the orange test, not the lime test,
It's the apple.
not the asparagus test. It's the lemon test. Lemon. What are the three parts of the lemon test? Hold on, lamp table, give me one.
Legitimate secular purpose.
Has to have a secular purpose. Lamp table, give me two.
Neither advances nor inhibits religion, and does not foster an excessive government entanglement with
Right,
religion.
those are the three. Establishment Clause. Okay. All right, what's the free exercise clause, Brittany?
You can't, you're allowed to
Can't stop the free exercise of religion. However, our government does it all the time. What are we not allowed to do in the free exercise of our religion?
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice animals.
Or people.
Or people. What else can't we do? Snort cocaine. Well, no, you might be able to smoke hookah. Okay? What else? Let's have some more legitimate things. What'd I say? Okay, we've denied some Islamic prisoners some, right? What did I say the courts can use? They can say, hey, we can limit the free exercise of your religion if, in order to do what for society? Health, safety, and morality, right? So what was the Reynolds versus U.S. case? Dealt with what, Tasha? Yeah, polygamy, right? In that particular case, court ruled against polygamy, to try to protect, young girls, right, from being forced into these relationships. So we made polygamy out of free exercise religion. What about parents denying medical care for children that are going to die if they don't get it? Is that a free exercise of my religion? No. I believe that, right? No. Okay, so we do limit our religious expression as well. Okay, good. All right, moving on to freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Okay? To begin with, what did I say the writers of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, what type of speech, expression, press, whatever, were they most concerned at protecting? What type?
Political.
Political, right? Our speech against the government. What the press, what newspapers, the media, right? The right to speak out against our government. Okay? So a couple of early examples, I don't want to spend a lot of time on them. The Alien and Sedition Acts, these are examples of where our government is trying to limit speech. Okay? Stand by. Hold on, let me make sure that we're still recording. We're good. Okay. So the Alien and Sedition Act is an early attempt, right? John Adams' administration was trying to limit speech against the government. There was a whole conflict between Great Britain and France going on, and so they passed the Alien and Sedition Act. Basically, it was done to limit attacks from Democratic Republicans on the Federalist Party. Jefferson becomes president, and he pardons everybody that was, found guilty under this act. The Civil War comes along. Lincoln does kind of the same thing, right? But he's trying to preserve the Union, so maybe we give him a little bit more of a pass, right? Newspaper editors, publishers that are they're secessionists, they're the border states. Lincoln's trying to keep the Union together. So, I put the people in jail. Why are you in jail? You're in jail. Why are you in jail? You're in jail. Why are you in jail? You're in jail. Oh my goodness, I'll be right back.
You better not.
I'm not going to answer this question. Sorry for those of you that are listening to me on YouTube. All right. All right. So those are a couple of early examples where our government is trying to step in and limit First Amendment rights. Let's get to where we have to remember these cases. All right. So the time period now is World War I. Congress has passed the Sedition Act, right? And seditious speech is any kind of speech that advocates the overthrowing of your government. Okay? So under the Sedition Act, this individual is going to be charged, Schenck, is going to be charged with sedition because he is advocating and encouraging people to not register for the draft, to not support the war effort during World War I. World War I was not a popular war to begin with. There certainly wasn't a popular support initially like World War II, right? We weren't invaded and so on and so forth. So Schenck gets arrested and charged under the Sedition Act. So it goes to the court. Schenck loses. The Supreme Court says that him going around and telling people to not register for the draft, to not support the war effort, was equivalent to like going into a crowded theater and yelling, "Fire." And that is not protected. It creates a clear and present danger. Okay? If you're not supporting your country during a time of world war, you are endangering your country. Okay? It creates a clear and present danger. So that's where we get this clear and present danger test with the Schenck versus United States decision. Now, is that the standard that we would hold today? Right? With what Schenck did, you think that we would have the same decision with his? Probably not, right? But we have a different standard. So let's watch briefly a video on Brandenburg versus Ohio. The Brandenburg decision, right, lays out really what kind of the current standard is, right? That speech can be limited or punished if it creates, right, an imminent lawless action. Okay? And both of those words are important. It has to be imminent, so it means it has to be what? Soon, right? And lawless, right? It has to be some type of action that is against the law, that's violent, so on and so forth. Okay? So obviously, if we had the Brandenburg test or the imminent lawless action test with the Schenck case, probably would, the guy would not have been convicted, right? They probably would have maybe ruled the Sedition Act unconstitutional. Okay? All right. Moving on. Let me get my. All right, next. This is dealing with an issue of the press with prior restraint. Okay? Anybody remember this case at all from reading it in the book or watching the video on the New York Times versus United States? Remember what it was about?
There was a dude who was maybe working in the Pentagon, and there were papers that he took and gave them to the New York Times, and they were about to publish it, but someone was like, "You're not allowed to do that." And
Nixon.
Nixon said, "You're not allowed to do that," and then that was big.
Yeah, there is. Yeah. So, yes, to fill in some of the specifics, right? So this individual worked at the Pentagon, and this deals with the Vietnam War. Okay? And so he gives to the New York Times some classified documents on what was really happening in Vietnam, right? Why we were there, casualty figures, the kinds of people that were getting killed, civilians, and so on and so forth, right? Certainly it was not very flattering to the United States government, and almost, not almost, but that the government had really been lying to the American people. Okay, so there's a lot that had to be published. This was going to be a series of articles. So the first one gets published. Nixon tries to issue an executive order to stop the New York Times from publishing the rest of it. Okay, claiming national security, they were classified documents, it was going to hurt the war effort, right? Creating a clear and present danger, whatever. So it goes to the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court says, no. We are not going to issue what is known as prior restraint. Prior restraint is stopping something from being published before it's published. It's censorship. Okay? Even though the New York Times had classified information, did they steal the information? No. So once they get it, the court said they've got freedom of the press, right? The court leaves open a little bit of a window that if you could truly show a national security risk to the country, then maybe they would issue prior restraint. However, what did I tell you? What's the biggest type of speech that the First Amendment is designed to protect? Political. This is exactly why we have freedom of the press, to say the things that our government is doing, okay? To be a watchdog on our government, okay? So I can't give you an example where our government has issued prior restraint, stopped something from being published. Now that may be because they stopped it, I don't know about it. Okay? So important case to know. All right, symbolic speech. Okay? Anybody read about Texas versus Johnson? This is the chapter, Texas versus Johnson, the chapter, I think it is. Yes, no, maybe? Yeah. So Texas versus Johnson deals with flag burning. Okay? The state of Texas had a law in place to protect the American flag. Made it against the law to burn the American flag in protest. Okay? So an individual is going to, Johnson is going to be charged for violating this law. Now, let's make sure we keep this in perspective. He wasn't arrested because he created a public hazard or a danger. He was arrested under a law for his action of burning the flag. Okay? So he challenges this law, goes to the court. Now the court's got to decide, is there a special status for the American flag, or is this protected symbolic speech? Much like the Tinker versus Des Moines case, which you should all know. If you don't know Tinker versus Des Moines, you don't love my dog. Right? Black arm dancers. So the Supreme Court, in a split decision, 5-4, very controversial, says that it is constitutional to do what? To burn the flag in protest. I'll never forget this case. This was the first year that I was a counselor at Buckeye Boys State, which is a program run by the American Legion. Very patriotic veterans organization. And this decision came out while I was there. And let's just say that we had a number of veterans that were not real happy with the Supreme Court decision that it's okay to burn the American flag. Okay? However, in order to change this, what would our government have to do? Something's unconstitutional. How do you make it constitutional? Yeah. You either have to pass an amendment or the Supreme Court has to change its mind. Right? Okay. Right, hate speech. This goes back to Brandenburg, but there are other cases. For the most part, what have we found out about hate speech? Is that protected or unprotected speech? Protected. Now, there is a little bit of a difference here. Are there such things as hate crimes? Yes. Can the government punish you differently for a hate crime? Yes. They have not made that connection to speech. If you kill somebody because they're black, and that's your motivation, you're going to go to jail longer than if you just kill somebody. Right? The government doesn't say, oh, well, that's a freedom of speech. You have a right to kill them because of that. That's just your political opinion. No, right? That's not the same thing. There's not a connection. Okay, we're talking about a crime, a physical, violent crime. We do have hate crimes that have been proved very much to be upheld by the courts. All right, let's look at some more unprotected types of speech. Real quick, the fighting words is easy, right? You're not allowed to go up to somebody in some public place and say, you know, yo mama is ugly, let's square up, go ahead, let's throw down, right? You tall and you stupid, right? And if they punch you, you don't get off. You don't get off, right? If you didn't throw a punch. Those are fighting words, that's not protected speech. Okay? Talked about that. Libel and slander. What's the difference between libel and slander? Let's go back to last AP student and ask her. Yes, miss?
Slander is almost speech, right?
Slander is spoken and libel is
Written.
Okay? Here's the other thing though. Libel and slander has to be false. It also has to be malicious and basically ruin someone's reputation, their career, so on and so forth. That's libel and slander. We have laws against these in the United States. All right. Some exceptions. Let's look at a couple of very important court cases related to libel and slander laws in our country. One, not to be confused with New York Times versus the United States, is New York Times versus Sullivan. The New York Times versus Sullivan, the New York Times was taken to court for libel and proved that the story that they had written was not true. It had caused some harm, damaged a person's reputation, and so went to the courts. The Supreme Court found in favor of the New York Times because they determined that the New York Times was not malicious in its intent. They had done their due diligence. They believed what they were printing was true. They had sources to back it up. It just turned out that it wasn't. Right? So this idea that the intent has to be malicious is really now kind of added to the standard. Okay? Here's another one. Jerry Falwell versus Hustler magazine. Jerry Falwell, anybody know who this guy is? Who he was? Still alive? I don't know. Jerry Falwell. Right, Jerry Falwell's very well known televangelist in the 1980s. Millions of people watched his show. Okay? Hustler magazine being an adult magazine. Well, Jerry Falwell would go on his show, preaching, and would rail against pornography, would attack Hustler magazine and its owner, Larry Flint. Actually made a movie called, I think it's the U.S. versus Larry Flint. Woody Harrelson does Larry Flint. You guys know Woody Harrelson is the movie up, but it's about this case. And so Hustler decides that it's going to get back at Reverend Falwell. So it decides it's going to do a political cartoon in its magazine. Political cartoon portrayed a very inappropriate relationship between Jerry Falwell and his mother. Okay? So Jerry Falwell sues Hustler magazine for libel. Goes all the way to the Supreme Court. So we have, in the Supreme Court of the United States, a case between a televangelist and a pornographic magazine. Can anybody say America? Eat your Christmas, right? So what does the Supreme Court say? Well, a couple things. One is that this political cartoon was obviously what form of information? When you try to make fun of something to the point where it's ridiculous and nobody believes it, what do we call that kind of writing or cartoons? We call it what?
Oh, wait.
We call it satire. Supreme Court said this is obviously satire. No one believes that this is the truth. So forget it. The other thing though is this. Keep in mind. They also viewed it differently because Jerry Falwell is a public and a well-known figure. There can be a different standard for those people, especially if you're a politician, an elected official, during the campaign, where you're going to get a lot more latitude to go after and say things about the governor of the state of Ohio, where you wouldn't be able to do that against just your neighbor. Again, why? Because the people that wrote the Bill of Rights were most concerned about protecting what type of speech? Political. Going after our government, speaking out against our government. There's a lot more latitude from the courts to do that than against the average citizen. Now, Falwell worked for the government? No. But he was a public figure who had made it his ambition to go after this industry. And so, of course, we're like, hey, you know what? Sorry. Can't work both ways, right? I mean, it's gotta work both ways. All right, so right from Hustler magazine into obscenity. The courts have said that obscenity is not protected speech. It's not protected in the press. However, here's the problem. Is that the guy who wrote this decision, I think it was Justice Brandeis, don't quote me on that. All my YouTube followers, if I'm wrong, you can leave a comment to the bottom of the page. Okay, is this. Brandeis said, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. Okay, so in the Miller versus California case, okay, the details aren't as important unless you get this particular case and you can give us what actually happened. The courts basically said this, is that adult material must have some redeemable artistic purpose. However, it is largely up to local communities to determine what they consider that to be. There is not a national standard. So, that is why some communities permit adult bookstores, adult establishments in their city limits, and other cities say, no, we do not permit that within our city limits, within our, right? That's federalism, really. Okay, so there isn't a national standard for what the courts would consider obscene and therefore can be limited speech. I'll give you an example, right? My best friend, Mr. Judge Lang over here, used to be the law director for the city of Athens. Well, the city of Athens had an ordinance that did not permit adult clubs to be within the city of Athens. Well, that club, not citing First Amendment rights, but citing the right to make a living right to operate a business right, which is also legitimate, sued the city of Athens and tried to get their establishment built anyways, and went after the city of Athens in court. It took a number of years, I believe, but who do you think won? The city of Athens won. Okay. Now, the other thing is this. Obscenity when it comes to the pornography adult film industry. Is the basis behind that expression? Or is the basis behind that money? Profit. Yes, right? What have I also told you about that? There's a lot less protection when you're talking about the motive being money. And by the way, I do appreciate you guys all being adults right now, okay? Than if it's freedom of expression. I'll give you another example. There's a very controversial artist who liked to photograph people in varying positions, but did it as an artist and would actually take these around to different art museums in the country. Came to Cincinnati. Cincinnati tried to bar that from being shown in their city at their art museum. Okay? This public art museum. And they lost. Because the motivation wasn't what? It wasn't money. It was a freedom of expression issue. Even though it was very controversial, you also didn't have to go see it. it was viewed differently. Okay? Questions about speech, examples of protected speech, unprotected speech. Okay? You should be familiar with terms like prior restraint. You need to be termed with libel and slander. Okay? Fighting words, imminent danger, lawless action. Okay? Yes? No? Maybe? How much time we got left? Okay. All right. So let's finish off, though, talking about assembly. We've already talked about this a little bit. I know in the fishbowl we talked about it. And right to petition, kind of how that falls into place. So assembly can be pretty controversial, right? I've told you before. When people get together to assemble, they don't just stand there, right? They're not just avengers. They do things. Okay? And they do some of the most controversial things, right? We have marches by neo-Nazis and members of the Klan, right? We burn crosses, right? We pass out machetes, whatever it might be when people assemble together. Okay? The key is this. The First Amendment doesn't say we have a right to assembly. We have a right to what type of assembly? A peaceful assembly. Okay? So that means that local governments, state governments are allowed to put in place things like time, place, and manner restrictions. What are those? What are time, place, and manner? They can tell you what? What time, right? Within, right? How? Where? Right. We have our homecoming parade. We've got guidelines we have to follow. The key is, though, time, place, and manner restrictions have to be applied how? Fairly. Same time, place, and manner restrictions that apply to our homecoming parade has to apply to a neo-Nazi group that might want to march to Marysville, whether we like that or not. Okay? This right was incorporated with the Dijon case in Oregon, Dijon, or Dijon J, if you're from southern France, that's how they pronounce it. This again was a communist group in Oregon. Something people just had something against communists. Okay, that they didn't want to assemble, and the communists won. Okay. What about like buffer zones though? Constitutional. The courts uphold the city of Columbus saying you can't assemble directly in front of an abortion clinic. So the courts uphold that law. Probably, right? They say you have to go across the street, okay? Or an adult bookstore. Or what about out here? Is this parking lot public? Yeah, it's a public school, right? What if somebody had a real problem with Mr. Scheer and him talking about how he loves communists all the time? And so they wanted to protest, picket right outside my window during my lectures. It's public ground, could they do that? Yeah, they wouldn't let them do that. Would they let them probably do it like back on that street back there? Yeah, right? Probably not on the highway.
Right on the highway.
That'd be
The
dangerous.
highway.
Okay. Yeah, how about this? The parking lot at Tuttle Mall. You don't like what some store's done, right? I don't know, they test perfumes on animals, like little puppies. And so you're gonna picket, right? Right. Tinker barely survived. That's why she's so small. She's actually supposed to be like this big. So I'm gonna protest this store. Can I do that in the parking lot at Tuttle Mall? Is the parking lot at Tuttle Mall public property? No, it's not. It's private property that the public goes to. There's a difference. Okay? That's why I get very furious and say this is a complete violation of the right to assemble. When I got to my car, someone has decided they want to put a flyer on my car to go to some local establishment or a church or something. Like, you have no, did you get permission from the owners of this parking lot to do this? Because if not, you have completely violated the intention of the right to assemble. That's wrong.
Sue 'em.
That's not
Sue 'em,
public,
yeah.
not public territory. Not
Sue
public.
'em.
All right. Okay. Last thing. So we have the right to petition our government, right? We have grievances against our government. We have the right to petition our government if we want certain laws to get passed, so on and so forth. This is also coming to the area of we have a right to freedom of association, right? So here's again the key. We have the right to belong to peaceful associations without our government. without having to tell our government, right? When I applied for a coaching position at Owen Tangy Liberty, they always like to be ahead of the curve because they think they're really cool. I actually had to sign a document on my form, and it listed probably 50 organizations on it that said that I had never or would never be a member of these organizations. They're all like terrorist organizations or hate groups. And looked very carefully. Sheer rights was not on the list. So I signed it in a clear conscience. Now, the difference is this. I had to voluntarily do that, right? I also had to, it's peaceful association. These groups are obviously been identified as hate groups and terrorist groups. Okay? But what about if an organization is ordered by the courts to hand over their membership list and where people live? Is that constitutional? Can the government do that? Okay? And NAACP versus Alabama, that's exactly what the state of Alabama tried to do. Back in the 50s, Alabama considered the NAACP to be a communist hate group that was just trying to disrupt American life, right? Well, that's because they were trying to get rights for African Americans, and it's Alabama's. So they give an order to the NAACP saying, hey, we want to know everybody that you have as a registered member in your organization and where they live. Rightly so, the NAACP says no, because we're probably certain that after you give that list to you, that list is going to end up in the hands of people who like to wear white hoods for a party. Okay, so the NAACP sues and says, no, we're not going to do that. Right? Goes to court, and they rule in favor of the NAACP. That there is a freedom of association, peaceful association, that is also inherent in the First Amendment. Okay? Questions? No? All right. How much time do we have left? Okay, get into groups of 4. I'm going to assign you cases that your group's going to be responsible for. Groups of 4.